Sex offenders, not a homogeneous group. It's Kathy. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and as requested in Zoom, this is your mini lecture on a little more detail than in the PowerPoint about sex offenders in general. There's a lot to be said about the differences between sex offenders and the kinds of crimes that they do. Within the groups of even doing like crimes, as well as across the groups of their separate crimes. Because after all, when we look at sex offenders, we have to look at those who commit stranger rape. We have to look at those who commit acquaintance rape, sexual homicide, sexual assault of children by family members, sexual assault by children by strangers, sexual assault in the helping professions, cyber and child pornography, child sex trafficking, adult sex trafficking, cyber stalking, in-person stalking. There are so many sexual offenders that are out there that when we talk about them or how we should control them or how we should make laws against them, a one-size-fits-all solution, the kind that politicians like to make, is doomed to fail. I'll start out with a few so that you get the drift of what the different ones are. Stranger rape, obviously, it's a crime that scares the community. We all feel at risk when we have a rapist loose amongst us. Oh my gosh. It's a low probability crime, even when we have one that we call the Dundalk rapist or the Lutherville rapist or the Westminster rapist. Even when there is a rapist loose amongst us in a specific community, it's still a low probability crime for you to fall victim to. Because frankly, even when there is one amongst us, it's really hard to be everywhere at once, right? Any of us finds that hard. So as a breakdown, a lot of professionals like categories because it helps keep everybody organized. So that makes us feel more in control, and it helps sometimes in profiling and searching for suspects because we're looking for certain types of people. So we like to understand the criminal's motivation in things. So the typology, we call it typologies, which are things that lead to like a profile. So when you hear typology, think in your head like this is how we profile somebody, the characteristics. So if we call rapists in various ways, different typologies, it will help us out in understanding their motivations, and we might understand the differences already in those sections. So we say, I'm going to use a 4-person one. There's a 3-category one. There's a 5-category one. There's a 7-category. So I'm going to use the 4-category one for adult sexual offenders. And one is compensatory rapist. Their motivation is typically for sex, and they actually use only as much force as they need to achieve their gratification. So they are also have been idolized or whatever as the gentleman rapist because they typically are polite. They want you to say perhaps that you love them or that it feels good or that they are doing as much for you as you are for them. So they want you to say you like it or something. So they are there to achieve gratification. They have a lot of feelings of inadequacy themselves. So their motivations are sexual in general. Versus the sadistic rapist where so the compensatory rapist, if you go along with their stuff, you'll probably get away and you'll be alive at the end of this. I'm not saying you won't be traumatized or anything else, that the impact is lessened that way, but frankly, you will survive. Versus the sadistic rapist where it can lead to murder if you fight and fail to fight, but it can lead to murder anyway. So you might want to fight them to get away with your life. They are also motivated a lot by sex, but they achieve the sexual gratification with your pain, with a victim's pain or their suffering or their fear. So that's what they get off on, and that is what they want. So they will escalate that to get their own gratification, and they don't really care about the safety of you. Versus the power and control rapist. Power and control may be aggressive, but their motivation is typically not all sexually motivated. They just desire or do desire dominance over a victim. They want maybe to humiliate a victim, to degrade a victim because they feel bad themselves. So they feel better and more gratified when you are degraded, and they are often angry. Now, there are other typology categories that actually separate out anger rapists versus sadistic rapists versus power rapists. That's another 3-category separation. But in this 4-person one, the power and control are in one that often includes an angry rapist in there. So they often want you to feel fearful of them, typically not going to kill afterwards. An opportunist rapist, like if you're an opportunist maker, like you make your opportunities. These are opportunist takers. They take whatever opportunity they have. Their motivation is less sexual in nature as well. They are compulsively, adventure seeking, and they lead those kinds of lifestyles. So their assault may be committed while committing another act. They may be breaking into your house for something and find you there. Oh my, I feel like having sex today, so I'll rape you as a result of that. So that may not even be their main goal when they start out. So they just have little impulse control. They feel an urge. They are at a bar. They meet you. They go and they rape you because that's what they feel like right then. And on another occasion, they may take someone out for a milkshake and go home. They're opportunists. And they can go sideways if things go awry, but typically they're not interested in killing somebody. So we've talked about stranger rape, where that causes all the fear of us, but frankly, the large majority of rapes or sexual assaults are acquaintance rapes. And those are when the stranger gets the headline, the actual provoking of fear. The acquaintance rape represents the typical rape scenario. It is someone who you know, who you trust, who you weren't afraid to get in a car with, who you weren't afraid to be at a home alone with, who you weren't afraid to be out with or to get high with or to get drunk with, because that's what friends do to each other and protect each other, and yet they take advantage of that. It can also be an acquaintance, not necessarily a good friend. Sexual homicide is a very small number. There's a sexual component to homicides each year, but that tends to be a pretty small percentage of that. And I want to talk something about crimes against children, sexual crimes against children, because there's also crimes against children of child abuse in a physical way. It's a little easier to put in a compartment when you've been physically abused, to kind of say to yourself, my dad or my mom still love me, but they didn't know how to control their anger, and so they couldn't show me that, and so they hit me, but they still love me. Where it's a little harder to put in that box when mom or dad still love me, but they had sex with me. What? That's a lot bit harder from a victimology standpoint. Anyway, let me be clear about crimes against kids and sex crimes in general against kids. The most dangerous place for a child always is in their own home, because that's where most of it occurs. Some may occur in their homes from the breakdown of family bonds and family boundaries, and an increased level of opportunity when a young relative babysits or there's less kind of supervision in the home. Again, we are almost addicted to being afraid, that fear sells, that we like being scared. So the Chester the molester who lurks behind bushes, yeah, that's who we're afraid of, but that's not a high probability. That's a really low probability crime. Yet that is who we fear. And the reason we have the sex registry at all is because of that fear. About 80,000 reports of child sexual abuse come in every year across the country. That is according to the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. They believe that's way underreported, obviously. Children are most vulnerable for sexual abuse between the ages of 7 and 13. That does not mean that there are not people who target infants even in their sexual assaults. Or pubescent kids. Prepubescent kids are those that are most vulnerable to sexual abuse. 96% of offenders were known to their victims. Okay, let me say that again in conjunction with that other thing I said again. The most dangerous place for children is in their own home, and 96% of offenders are known to their victims. That takes away a whole lot of that community fear, but puts people at fear in their own homes, where we're supposed to feel the sanctity of our homes, safest in our homes. We're supposed to be most protected in our homes, which makes the betrayal within those walls even tougher to deal with. 20% are dads, 50% are acquaintances and friends. Girls are abused within the families at higher numbers than boys. Not more boys are molested by those outside the family, because it's still a majority that are molested by people they know. But boys are more likely to be the victims in those outside the family situations than when compared to girls. A third of all sex crimes against juveniles, against minors, okay, so over a third of all sex crimes against juveniles are committed by other juveniles. That's huge. That's big. And it tells us our problem isn't Chester the molester down the street hiding out behind a bush, or, oh my God, I'm afraid to send my kid anywhere because they're going to be, no. Many of them are, molested in their own homes, and a third of children who are molested are going to be molested by other juveniles. So, but for those numbers that we made, the sex offense registry are those dangerous pedophiles, right? So what's a pedophile? A pedophile are by far not our large majority of people who molest children. Because remember, if you're a juvenile and you molest another child, doesn't mean you're a pedophile at all. Things are warped in your life. They're definitely askew and need to be accountable and yet treated in a way that we can ensure that you be safer going forward for both the victim and the offender. But pedophiles get all the news because because Nancy Grace told us years ago, child molesters cannot be cured. Sex offenders cannot be cured. Of course, because sex offender isn't a crime. Child molester isn't a crime. Sexual assault is a crime. Pedophiles are a diagnosis. So sex offender is not a diagnosis. Child molester, not a diagnosis. Pedophilia, pedophiles. Hebephils, those who like pubescent children. So a more accepted group in those December-May relationships, in the rock star relationships when they're 50 years old and have a kid with a 21-year-old or an 18-year-old, those kinds. But a hebephile is someone who likes pubescent, where pedophiles are really reserved for those who are sexually attracted and sexually aroused by prepubescent children. So that can be 9, 10, because our level of pubescence, especially for females, has gone down over the last 20, 30 years. So there you go, lower and lower. I like a comment that Fred Berlin made, and Fred Berlin is the director of the Hopkins Sex and Gender clinic. You should know something. He and I don't have a good relationship. He and I go back to when I prosecuted a long time ago, and we did not like each other. I cross-examined him more than anyone else. He actually was the expert witness for Jeffrey Dahmer, and I actually got to help the prosecutor in Milwaukee against Jeffrey Dahmer in his case, because I had cross-examined Fred Berlin more than other people had, because he was from Baltimore. That's why. He wrote a book, Men Who Rape, and he treats sex offenders in general. But that doesn't mean that I don't respect his knowledge of the field just because we were on opposite sides for a long time. And the first time that I was in my doctorate program in psychology, my boss, my supervisor at my practicum at Springfield Hospital, the forensic unit, made me introduce him in grand rounds. So I had to look up all the nice things about him. And yes, so there's a respect there. It's just not, so we don't have a great relationship. But he made a quote that says, people don't choose what arouses them, they discover it. If we think about that, even in pedophile land, there has to be some understanding that that would be true. If they're true pedophiles and they're sexually aroused by them, they didn't say when they were 8 years old, I want to grow up and be sexually attracted to kids. They didn't say when they were 12, that's what they wanted to do. They discovered it. So remember, because if we believe that we chose what arouses them, then we go backwards in the LGBTQ relationships, because we're saying that we all get to pick who we're attracted to. We know that's not true. That doesn't mean that we hold people less accountable if they abuse them, right? And I know I have to go fast because I'm past the 15 minutes that I like to keep these at. So let me just quickly go over that there are two kind of gradations that we move towards, just like gender. If you've heard, us talk in sociology about it, it's on a continuum. Sex is even on a continuum. We're not all testosterone males or all like frilly females, there's this gradation of regress versus fixated kinds of pedophiles. That's the older nomenclature. We now like to say preferential versus situational. So regressed pedophiles are now considered situational. Preferential are more fixated. The closer you get there, the more likely to be diagnosed as a pedophile, versus if I'm truly just a situational one, I've taken advantage of a situation, or I might be under a stressor and my spouse might be ridden with cancer and is terminal, and I have no sexual partner, and the kind of boundaries in my family have broken down, and so I reach out to a teenage step child rather than my spouse because my spouse is unavailable. That kind of thing doesn't mean they're going to go predatory in the community at large. Doesn't mean they're not accountable for what they did and that they don't need punished for what they did. No, that's not what I'm saying. So please don't confuse that. But it does mean that there is a difference in how fearful we need to be on the streets if I'm looking to where I want to live with my kids. Regressed or situational pedophiles tend to come in three categories. A completely regressed category of situational are people with poor coping skills. They target the victim because they're easily accessible. They abuse kids as a substitute for an adult relationship, and just like the one I just talked about. Morally indiscriminate is one that doesn't prefer children over adults. They just use children and anyone else they can have access to for their own interest, whether they be sexual interest or whether they be go to the store and get me something or cook for me or do whatever. Sexually indiscriminate versus morally indiscriminate. Sexually indiscriminate ones are mainly interested in sexual experimentation and will just use anybody to get their jollies, to use that sexual experimentation, not necessarily more attracted to a kid, just will use a kid like they'll use an adult or a disabled adult, anything. And then there are those inadequate ones. I'm sorry, there were 4 categories of that one. Inadequate ones. And those are the social misfits, that they just are insecure. They have low self-esteem. Gee whiz. Those are kind of symptoms of what we look like and look for in victims of sexual abuse, that they are insecure and they have low self-esteem. And they're, yeah. But anyway, these are people who grow up inadequate, and they really see kids as their only outlet because they're inadequate to get an adult relationship. Okay, go over to the more preferential category, and we will see seductive people who actually seduce and court and manipulate because they go through the grooming process, we call it, of getting a child involved in a relationship. They give them gifts, they give them affection, and they truly believe they're in a relationship with them. They're the ones that used to belong to those weird groups like NAMBLA, the NAMBLA is the Man Boy Love Association. They believe that, they had the category sex before 8, before it's too late, that kind of thing. So they truly believe they're in relationships. They believe these children are capable of the emotional relationship that they need back. So they might give them pearl earrings. We've had them give incredibly expensive jewelry, expensive gifts to these children just so they can carry on a relationship. They also may give them more affection if they are in a position of power, like had a preacher that we had that was giving more affection to the boy that needed affection in a one-parent household where his mom was the single parent who always had to work, that kind of thing. There are, in the preferential stage, the truly fixated ones, and they are compulsively attracted to kids. They have poor psychosexual development, and their affection is to compulsively be and get their sexual arousal from children. Versus the sadistic ones, the most absolutely extremely dangerous ones in terms of not just sexual gratification, but also physical danger to children. They are aggressive and they're sexually excited by violence. Don't think you can't be a fixated, sadistic kind of pedophile and be a juvenile, because in your teenage years is usually when we're discovering who we're attracted to. So there can be a 16-year-old sadistic pedophile. Don't think they can't be dangerous to their victims. They can. Just understand that the sex registry is this bad thing that has, it's not all bad. It was developed so that we would get rid and keep track of people who were truly dangerous to our children. What has become is there are over 850,000 people every year on this thing, and there's just too many to follow. And in the beginning we were like, oh yeah, let's give them all GPS, ankle bracelets, let's do this, let's do that. Well, and all we've done is deny them the ability to actually have a good life, which are not all like people that have done horrendous things now, nor people that we should be afraid of. We've really got to decide, right? Who we're afraid of and who we're just mad at. We're just mad at 19-year-old Frank Rodriguez, who actually had sex with a 16-year-old when he was 19. He's now 30. And guess what? That 16-year-old is his wife and has been, and they have children and all of that. But he is on the sex registry for the rest of his life, because when he was 19, he had sex with his soon-to-be wife, or not soon-to-be wife, but his eventual wife. So, gee, they follow him around. He can't get good housing because the public gets to know. And then people come around and give out flyers. Look what sex offender lives in our neighborhood. And they lose jobs. And I had a young boy who was 21. He was convicted for something that he did when he was 18. He had sex with an underage person. He's now 21. It was an acquaintance, a person that would come and go in their own homes. And he's 21. He got a job finally at a supermarket. And guess what? A KinderCare moved in. So guess what happened to him? He had to lose his job because you can't be within a certain radius of a childcare facility, of an elementary school or a high school or any kind of school. You can't be around unsupervised anybody who's under 18. So gee, and in Maryland, you can be around your own child sometimes. You can get permission for that. So, but in some states, you can't even do that, like West Virginia. So the purpose of the sex registry also was to use social stigma to buttress the law. But what is it's become is harassment to a whole lot of other people who are not dangerous to us. And so here we are 25 minutes in, and I try to make these 15 or less. So that's what I had to say about that. But I have, frankly, days more worth of information to say because this is my lifeblood. This is where I spent my time. But thanks for listening. I hope you did. Anyway, I hope you learned something. If you did, I hope you did. Thanks. Bye. Have a good whatever rest of the day you have.